The Mary Rose sank on the 19th of July, 1545, in sight of the English shore. Over 400 men went down. The standard explanation survived for centuries. Open gun ports, a sudden list, water coming in faster than anyone could stop it. That explanation was never wrong. But it was never the whole story either. Decades after the ship was raised, scientists began testing the teeth of the men who drowned. And a more tempting interpretation appeared. Perhaps the crew had been foreign-born. Perhaps they had not understood the orders. Perhaps the disaster was not mechanical, but human in a different and more uncomfortable sense. That version sounded logical. It also happened to be convenient. What the teeth actually said was something harder to simplify. In 1982, Britain recovered the ship. Decades later, Bone and Tooth began recovering the crew. Before she was a cradle on television, Mary Rose was a fighting ship off Portsmouth, turning toward a French fleet with gun ports open and hundreds of men crowded into a wooden machine. She was built in 1509, early in Henry VIII's reign, rebuilt and extended more than once across her career. She was not a symbol when she sailed. She was a tool, a floating gun platform, a platform for archers, a place where servants of the Tudor state lived, trained, and worked in close quarters. The hull that came out of the Solent in 1982 was what remained of all of that. The men inside the hull had been easier to forget. The battle that ended her matters because it fixes the hour precisely. On July 19, 1545, the ship was not lost in distant ocean. She sank in sight of shore, close enough for power to watch, and too fast for power to help. Henry VIII was present at Southsea Castle. The French fleet that entered the Solent that morning was not a rumor, but an invasion force, and Mary Rose was turning to engage it. The fight that followed lasted long enough for the king to see his flagship go down. What the official record could not preserve was a precise account from the men below decks who did not survive to give one. The best contemporary account is plain enough. Vanderdelft, the imperial ambassador, wrote on July 24, 1545, reporting what a Flemish survivor told him. The ship heeled, the lower gun ports went under, and the sea entered where the guns had just fired. The lower gun ports had been left open after firing. The ship rolled. The sea came in fast. It is not a complicated mechanism. A working warship with open gun ports low to the waterline, a sudden list, and not enough time to correct. That account remained the structural explanation for centuries, and nothing uncovered since has fully replaced it. What it always lacked was a reason for the list itself. Wind, poor sail handling, the weight of extra men taken on for the engagement. None of these answers settles cleanly. What the record does settle on is the speed of the end. But if the physical mechanism was always available, why did a different story eventually emerge? One that moved the cause from the ship to the men inside her. That question is worth keeping. For centuries, the argument stayed close to the ship. Ports, wind, weight, discipline. The men inside the hull were counted, mourned, and then flattened into crew. They entered history as a round number, over 400 men. Lost. The names of a few officers survived through letters and administrative records. The rest were cargo in the historical sense. Present, accounted for, gone. This was not negligence on the part of historians. There was simply nothing to recover. The seafloor does not produce letters. The silt does not preserve memory. For most of the centuries between 1545 and the late 20th century, the best available evidence for the crew was the shape of the ship itself, and the ship said very little about the people who had served in her. That began to change in 1965. The modern search began with Project Solent Ships, a systematic survey of the Solent seabed. By 1971, exposed timbers had made the old wreck newly physical. Divers located structural remains consistent with a large Tudor vessel. The site was designated a protected wreck in 1974. The excavation that followed was a grid, silt moved by hand and airlift. each find logged in position before removal. An object lifted without record is evidence with its story removed. The bones that would later yield isotope data could only be read because the excavation had kept its context intact. The hull was not the only target. It was the culmination of a process that treated the entire seafloor as a document. On October 11, 1982, the frame and cradle did what the 16th century could not. They brought up the surviving side of the ship, not as legend, but as wet timber under load. The Togmore crane barge and its hydraulic jacks brought the hull to the surface intact. The watching public saw something that had been 4.5 centuries underwater. The moment was genuine. The recovery it represented was real. What the cameras could not show was that a second recovery was already in progress, slower and less visible, inside the bones that had come up with the ship. The hull was the headline, but the evidence was everywhere. Weapons, tools, chests, arrows, timber, bone. A ship is not only a shape, it is a workplace preserved in panic. When the Mary Rose sank, she went down with her daily reality still aboard. Barber surgeon instruments, leather shoes, pewter plates, game boards, a chest of longbows knocked and ready. These were not display objects. They were the material of a working life interrupted in seconds. The skeletal material was part of that same archive. Approximately 9,000 human skeletal elements were recovered, 92 fairly complete skeletons, a minimum of 179 individuals. A 2021 review increased that count to 98 fairly complete skeletons, each one a person the record had filed as a number. The anti-boarding netting was meant to keep enemies out. When the ship rolled, it helped keep her own men in. Mary Rose carried netting rigged over the waist of the ship, a standard Tudor naval precaution against boarding parties in close combat. In the seconds after the list began, that netting became a barrier in the wrong direction. Men who might have gone over the side instead were held. The water came to them. The thing designed to stop enemies became the thing that stopped escape. Vanderdelft heard about 25 or 30 survivors. Modern summaries often say roughly 35 to 40. Either way, almost everyone under the netting disappeared into the same few minutes. Over 400 men, roughly 35 to 40 survivors. The rest went down with the hull, into the Solent silt, and stayed there. The silt turned out to be preservation rather than erasure, and what it preserved would eventually complicate the story considerably. 172 longbows came up with the hull, over 2,000 complete arrows, approximately 7,000 arrow fragments. 24 wrist guards, the narrow strips of leather worn over the lower forearm to protect against the snap of the bowstring on release. These numbers describe not an ornamental detail, but an industrial capacity. The wrist guard is worn by a specific kind of body, one trained from childhood to draw a bow that required enough sustained force to deform the skeleton over years of use. The asymmetric bone development visible in Mary Rose's archers is consistent with that kind of long-term physical conditioning. These were not men who had picked up a weapon. They were men whose bodies had been shaped by a practice that began in youth. One of those wrist guards was still in position over the lower arm of the man the museum calls the Royal Archer. The Royal Archer is not a name, but he is no longer only a skeleton. He was in his early 20s, approximately 179 centimeters tall, strongly built, found with a broken longbow and a wrist guard still placed over his lower arm. His teeth carry isotope signals consistent with a hot climate upbringing. The museum notes that he may have grown up in North Africa, though the language is deliberately cautious. The isotope evidence can narrow a range. It cannot hand us a town. The physical evidence places him clearly enough. The broken bow, the worn wrist guard, the asymmetric skeletal development consistent with years of archery. He was doing his job when the ship went down. The isotope evidence does not let us pin him to a single place. It lets us say the old narrow story is too small. The second man is designated FCS-09 in the 2021 study, and the museum calls him the Young Mariner. His teeth point toward coastal southwest Britain in terms of childhood environment. His ancestry analysis supports African heritage. That combination matters. African descent in a British upbringing inside Henry VIII's Navy. Scorer and colleagues described FCS-09 as the first direct evidence for mariners of African descent serving in Henry VIII's Navy. The finding is described as evidence, not proof, but the direction the evidence points is consistent, and it does not require interpretive stretch to reach. These two men are not the whole crew. They are 2 out of 8 sampled in 2021, out of a minimum of 179 recovered individuals, out of more than 400 who drowned. But they are specific, and specificity is what the record had always refused to provide. Teeth do not keep diaries, but they keep chemistry. Strontium, oxygen, sulfur, carbon, nitrogen. 5 quiet measurements that can narrow childhood diet, climate, geology, and distance from the coast. Each isotope offers a different signal. Strontium reflects the geology of water and food during tooth formation in childhood. Oxygen tracks climate and rainfall. Sulfur and carbon provide information about diet and coastal proximity. Nitrogen signals protein sources. Together, these measurements can separate someone who grew up in coastal Western Britain from someone who grew up in a warmer, geologically distinct region further south. As many as 3 of the 8 sampled crew members had signals tentatively consistent with warmer, southerly origins. 5 indicated Western Britain. The method does not produce a map with a pin in it. It produces a range, a tendency, a pattern. A tooth is not a passport, but it can remember water, stone, and climate for 500 years. That limit matters enormously for what came next. After the ship rolled, the men left almost no words of their own. For more than 4 centuries, the record kept the event and lost the lives inside it. This is where reconstruction has to begin from bone. It is not a biography, it is a chemical signature, but it is something the official record never provided. And when that signature appeared, an interpretation followed that was neat, explanatory, and not supported by the evidence. Some earlier interpretations pulled the isotope evidence toward a clean, causal story. Foreign crew, poor communication, fatal maneuver. The logic ran as follows. If some men grew up outside Britain, they may have had difficulty understanding orders in English. If orders were misunderstood at a critical moment, the ship may have been mishandled. If the ship was mishandled, that could explain the list that killed her. The theory turned diversity into evidence of failure. It had a certain logic. It explained the loss without requiring mechanical failure or bad luck. It also required the evidence to be far more specific than it actually was. Later criticism and the 2021 multi-isotope study require a more careful version. Diversity was present, but it is not a shortcut cause of the sinking. The Mary Rose Trust's own materials note that foreign sailors were not unusual in English ships of the period. If a language barrier were such a decisive factor, the same problem would have applied across the Tudor fleet as a matter of routine. It did not produce routine catastrophe. Millard and Schroeder raised related concerns in their 2010 critique. The 2021 study refined the diversity evidence but did not restore the causal chain. The miscommunication theory is a story that needed the evidence to be more specific than it was. My read is that the miscommunication theory says more about later expectations than about the men in the hull. It is a story that needed a reason, and it found one in the idea of a crew that did not fully belong. That is a familiar shape for a disaster narrative. It moves responsibility away from a mechanical system and places it on people who can be characterized as outsiders. The record does not support that placement. The men who went down with the Mary Rose were not, as far as the evidence shows, confused. They were in the wrong place at a very fast moment. The sea came in too quickly for most of them to do anything about it. The netting held them. The gun ports were already open. Those are the mechanisms the record actually provides. A cautious reading of the bones does not make the sinking simpler. It makes the Navy larger than the neat national story later histories often preferred. The Mary Rose was an English warship, built in English yards, commanded by an English admiral, part of an English fleet operating in defense of the English coast. It was also crewed by men whose childhood signals point across a wider geography than a single island. The isotope evidence, carefully read, does not produce a dramatically diverse crew. It produces a crew with some members who grew up in climates and geologies outside Britain, serving alongside men who grew up on the western coast of the island. The Mary Rose was English power. The people serving that power were not reducible to a single island story. That is a different reading of Tudor naval history than the cleaner version produced. It is not a rebuttal, it is a complication. And complications are what the record had always been unable to carry. The science can recover ancestry signals and childhood chemistry. It cannot recover what FCS-09 called himself, what language his family used at home, or what the Royal Archer thought when the ship began to heal. The isotope record tells us where bodies were formed. It does not tell us what those bodies contained in the way of memory, loyalty, fear, or preference. The men recovered from the Solent silt are better understood now than they were before the excavation. They are not fully understood. They were people. The record that people generate, in letters, in testimony, and self-description, was not preserved by the silt. What they called themselves, who they thought they were, what they made of their childhood in a distant place, or their service in Henry VIII's Navy, the record does not say. The 1982 lift was real recovery, but it was not the end of recovery. It raised the ship before anyone had learned how to listen to the crew. The hull was the largest and most visible piece of evidence from the sinking, but the human evidence that came up with it, the bones, the teeth, the chemical signatures locked in enamel, required decades of further science to read. The isotope techniques applied in 2021 did not exist in 1982. The ancestry estimation methods did not exist in 1982. The recovery of the crew was not complete when the cameras broadcast the lift. It may not be complete now. The remaining skeletal material has not been fully analyzed. Other men are still in the archive, still holding their chemistry, waiting for a question the science has not yet learned to ask. The ship was raised. The men inside it are still being recovered. The last image is not a king watching a ship go down. It is a young archer's wrist guard beside the bones that brought his crew back into history. No name, a broken longbow, a strip of leather over the lower arm. Found in position, as if the work had not been finished when the ship rolled. The Royal Archer was in his early 20s. His teeth suggest he grew up somewhere warmer than England. He was carrying the equipment of his trade when the Solent took him. For more than 4 centuries, the record kept the event and kept the king on the shore watching, and left the men inside the ship as a number. The wrist guard is a small correction to that record. Not a name, not a verdict, not an explanation of the sinking. An object worn against the string. Enough to make the ship human again.